40 years ago, on a bitter December night in 1966, two orphaned sisters vanished from St. Catherine's Home for Children in rural Vermont. 8-year-old Mary Morton and her 6-year-old sister Elizabeth disappeared without leaving a single trace, plunging their caretakers into despair and the tight-knit community of Millbrook into confusion and fear that would haunt them for decades. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and ring the bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. The Morton sisters had arrived at St. Catherine's just 2 months earlier, on a grey October afternoon that matched the tragedy that had brought them there. Their parents, Robert and Helen Morton, had died in a horrific car accident on Route 108 during an early snowstorm. Robert, a mechanic at the local garage, had been driving Helen to her evening shift at the textile mill when their car skidded on black ice and collided head-on with a logging truck. Both died instantly, leaving behind 2 little girls who suddenly had no one in the world. Sister Margaret O'Brien, the stern but seemingly compassionate head nun who had personally welcomed the girls to St. Catherine's, would later describe them as inseparable in their grief. Mary, with her serious dark eyes and protective instincts that seemed far too mature for her 8 years, rarely left Elizabeth's side. The younger girl, blonde and bright-eyed despite her trauma, possessed a curious nature and infectious laughter that seemed to brighten even the darkest corners of the imposing Victorian building that had become their home. St. Catherine's Home for Children was a 3-story red brick structure that had stood sentinel over Millbrook Valley since 1894. Built with donations from wealthy Catholic families in Boston, it had housed thousands of orphaned and abandoned children over the decades. The building's Gothic architecture, with its tall windows and imposing bell tower, was meant to inspire reverence and respect. To many children, however, it simply inspired fear. In 1966, 32 children called St. Catherine's home. They ranged in age from 4 to 16, most of them wards of the state who had nowhere else to go. The facility was run by 6 nuns from the Sisters of Mercy Order, led by the formidable Sister Margaret, who had been at St. Catherine's for nearly 20 years. The daily routine was rigid and disciplined. Morning prayers at 6 a.m., breakfast in the communal dining hall, lessons in the makeshift classrooms, more prayers before lunch, afternoon chores, evening prayers, and lights out at 8 p.m. sharp. The other children at the orphanage had quickly grown fond of the Morton sisters, despite the institutional atmosphere that discouraged deep personal attachments. Elizabeth's questions about everything she saw, from the stained glass windows in the chapel to the way snow formed on the window panes, had a way of making even the most hardened children smile. Mary, meanwhile, had appointed herself protector not just of Elizabeth, but of several of the younger children who seemed lost in the institutional system. On December 15, 1966, evening prayers concluded at 7 p.m. as always in the main chapel, where all 32 children gathered in wooden pews worn smooth by decades of use. Sister Agnes Murphy, the youngest of the nuns at just 24 years old, conducted the final head count before bedtime, a ritual she had performed hundreds of times without incident. All 32 children were accounted for, including Mary and Elizabeth, who had been seen brushing their teeth in the communal bathroom just after prayers ended. The girls' dormitory on the 2nd floor housed 12 girls in 6 sets of bunk beds. Mary and Elizabeth shared a bottom bunk near the window, where they could see the lights of Millbrook Village twinkling in the distance. Several of the other girls would later remember seeing the sisters whispering together before falling asleep, which wasn't unusual. The 2 girls often comforted each other with quiet conversations about their parents and their hope that somehow, someday, they might have a real family again. But when Sister Agnes rang the morning bell at 5:45 a.m. on December 16th and began her routine wake-up calls, she made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The bottom bunk near the window was empty. The sheets were still warm, as if the girls had only recently left, but Mary and Elizabeth Morton were nowhere to be found. The initial search was frantic, but systematic. Sister Agnes, trying to maintain composure despite her growing panic, checked every bathroom, every closet, every corner of the dormitory. She woke the other children and questioned them carefully, but no one had heard anything unusual during the night. No crying, no footsteps, no doors opening or closing. It was as if Mary and Elizabeth had simply evaporated into the cold December air. Sister Margaret was summoned immediately. Her reaction, according to witnesses, was one of controlled panic. She immediately ordered a full search of the building while dispatching Sister Thomas to call the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. By 7 a.m., every nun and older child was searching every room, every basement storage area, every attic space where two frightened little girls might be hiding. Sheriff William Crawford arrived at 7:30 a.m. with 2 deputies and immediately took control of the situation. A tall, methodical man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, Crawford had handled missing person cases before, but never involving children this young from what was supposed to be a secure facility. His first instinct was that the girls had run away, perhaps trying to return to some familiar place from their life before the orphanage. The local sheriff's department launched an immediate and comprehensive search operation. Deputies combed through every inch of the 3-story Victorian building, from the bell tower to the basement coal bins. They searched the surrounding woods with tracking dogs borrowed from the state police, organized volunteer search parties that scoured the Vermont countryside, and put out alerts to police departments as far away as Montreal and Boston. The investigation quickly revealed something deeply troubling that would puzzle law enforcement for decades. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the building. Every window was locked from the inside. Every door was secure. The main entrance was always locked after evening prayers, and Sister Margaret personally held the only key. The building's security, while not sophisticated by modern standards, was thorough enough to prevent 2 small children from simply walking out undetected. The case consumed the small community of Millbrook for months. Local volunteers organized search parties that continued well into the spring of 1967, combing through forests, abandoned buildings, and remote farms throughout the valley. The story made headlines in newspapers across Vermont and even attracted attention from national media outlets fascinated by the mystery of 2 little girls who had seemingly vanished from a locked building. The nuns at St. Catherine's never stopped hoping, never stopped praying, but as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the active investigation slowly wound down. Sheriff Crawford, despite his best efforts and the efforts of investigators from the state police, could find no trace of Mary and Elizabeth Morton. The case remained officially open, but with no new leads and no evidence to pursue, it gradually faded from public attention. The Morton sisters became another entry in Vermont's cold case files, their disappearance a painful mystery that haunted everyone who had known them. The other children at St. Catherine's spoke of them in whispers for years afterward, and several former residents would later claim they had seen the ghostly figures of 2 little girls walking the hallways on cold winter nights. Some mysteries wait decades to reveal their secrets, and some secrets are hidden in the very places we think we know best, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the official story. The disappearance of Mary and Elizabeth Morton didn't just vanish from police files. It carved permanent scars into the hearts of everyone at St. Catherine's Home for Children. The institutional atmosphere, already rigid and austere, became suffocating in the weeks following their disappearance. Sister Margaret O'Brien, who had held both girls on their first terrifying night at the orphanage and had seemed to take a special interest in their welfare, aged visibly in the aftermath of their vanishing. The other children at St. Catherine's reported nightmares and anxiety attacks, afraid they too might disappear without warning in the middle of the night. Several of the younger children began wetting their beds, something that hadn't happened since their first weeks at the orphanage. The older children formed protective groups, refusing to be alone and insisting on sleeping with lights on, a request that Sister Margaret denied, claiming it would interfere with proper rest. Sister Agnes Murphy, the young nun who had discovered the empty beds, was particularly devastated by the girls' disappearance. She had grown especially fond of Mary and Elizabeth, seeing in them a sweetness and resilience that reminded her why she had entered religious life in the first place. In the weeks following their disappearance, Sister Agnes lost weight and developed a nervous habit of constantly checking and rechecking the other children's beds throughout the night. The investigation, led by Detective Frank Harrison of the Vermont State Police, initially followed every conceivable lead with methodical precision. Harrison, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for never giving up on missing person cases, brought a team of specialists from Burlington to examine every aspect of the disappearance. They interviewed every staff member multiple times, administered polygraph tests to all the adults who had access to the building, and questioned each of the 30 remaining children with gentle but thorough techniques designed for young witnesses. The groundskeeper, Thomas Byrne, who had worked at St. Catherine's for 15 years, became an early focus of the investigation. A quiet man in his 50s who lived alone in a small cottage on the property, Byrne was known to be particularly fond of the children and often gave them small treats or helped them with outdoor chores. Several children reported that Byrne had been especially kind to Mary and Elizabeth, teaching them about the local wildlife and showing them where to find bird nests in the spring. Detective Harrison spent hours interrogating Byrne, whose nervous demeanor and difficulty maintaining eye contact made him seem suspicious. However, multiple witnesses confirmed that Byrne had been in his cottage all evening on December 15th, playing cards with two friends from town. The men provided solid alibis for each other, and no evidence could be found linking Byrne to the girl's disappearance. The investigation also focused intensively on Father Michael O'Connell, the elderly priest who visited St. Catherine's twice weekly to conduct special masses and provide spiritual counseling to the children. Father O'Connell, 73 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been at the orphanage on December 15th for the evening service. Several children reported that he had seemed particularly interested in talking with Mary and Elizabeth after prayers, but the priest's failing memory made him an unreliable witness to his own actions. What troubled Detective Harrison most profoundly was the complete absence of any disturbance or struggle. The dormitory where the Morton sisters slept housed 12 girls total, ages 6 to 14, in 6 sets of bunk beds arranged in 2 neat rows. The beds were positioned close enough together that any unusual movement or sound should have woken at least one of the other children. Yet not a single girl reported hearing anything unusual that night. No crying, no footsteps, no doors opening or closing, no whispered conversations or sounds of struggle. The beds themselves provided another puzzle. When Sister Agnes discovered them empty on the morning of December 16th, they appeared to have been slept in recently. The sheets were still warm to the touch, the pillows still bore the indentations of small heads, and the blankets were pushed back as if the girls had simply gotten up to use the bathroom. But both girls' shoes were missing from beside their beds, along with their winter coats from the dormitory closet. The case took an even more mysterious turn when investigators discovered that the orphanage's eastern wing, a section of the building that housed administrative offices, storage rooms, and some unused dormitory space, had been locked and sealed off just 3 days before the girls vanished. Sister Margaret explained that they had discovered extensive water damage from a burst pipe in the basement and were waiting for insurance adjusters and repair crews to assess the situation. Detective Harrison requested immediate access to examine the sealed wing, suspecting it might provide clues about the girl's disappearance. However, Sister Margaret explained that the keys had been turned over to the maintenance company hired by the insurance company, and retrieving them would require approval from the diocesan authorities in Burlington. She produced official-looking paperwork showing that the insurance company had recommended sealing the area to prevent further water damage and mold growth. The detective found this bureaucratic maze frustrating, but not necessarily suspicious. After all, religious institutions were notorious for their complex hierarchies and procedures, and it seemed unlikely that anyone would connect a sealed-off administrative area to the disappearance of 2 little girls from a dormitory on the opposite side of the building. When Detective Harrison finally gained access to examine the sealed eastern wing 2 weeks later, he found exactly what Sister Margaret had described: clear evidence of water damage in the basement, with several burst pipes that had flooded storage rooms and caused significant damage to walls and flooring. The insurance adjuster's report confirmed that the area needed extensive repairs before it could be safely occupied again. The detective's examination of the sealed wing was thorough, but revealed nothing suspicious. The administrative offices contained typical paperwork and supplies. The unused dormitory rooms were empty, except for old furniture covered with dust sheets. The basement showed clear evidence of the recent flooding, with water stains on the walls and damaged boxes of old records and supplies. As 1967 dawned cold and bleak without any new leads in the Morton case, public interest began to wane. The initial media attention faded as other stories captured the public's attention, and the volunteer search parties that had combed the Vermont countryside throughout the winter gradually disbanded. Detective Harrison continued his investigation with dogged determination, but the trail had grown completely cold. The detective retired in 1974, taking the unsolved Morton case with him as one of his greatest professional regrets. In his final report, he wrote, "Despite extensive investigation involving local, state, and federal resources, no evidence has been found to determine what happened to Mary Morton, age 8, and Elizabeth Morton, age 6, on the night of December 15th or 16, 1966. The case remains open, but without new evidence or witnesses, there are no active leads to pursue. In small communities, some wounds never fully heal. They just learn to hide beneath layers of time and silence, while those who remember carry the weight of unanswered questions." By the early 1980s, St. Catherine's Home for Children had begun its slow transformation from a bustling orphanage into something entirely different. The changing social landscape of America meant that fewer children needed institutional care, and those who did were increasingly placed in smaller foster homes rather than large institutional facilities. The Victorian building that had once echoed with the voices and footsteps of dozens of children grew quieter each year. The decline began gradually in the 1970s. New social services programs and increased federal funding for family preservation meant that many children who might once have been sent to orphanages instead remained with extended family or were placed in carefully screened foster homes. By 1978, St. Catherine's housed only 18 children, rattling around in a building designed for 3 times that number. Sister Margaret O'Brien, now in her 60s, remained as the facility's administrator throughout this transition. The years had not been kind to her. The stress of running an institution during a period of declining resources and changing social attitudes had taken a visible toll. But it was the memory of Mary and Elizabeth Morton that seemed to weigh on her most heavily, a burden she carried like a physical weight that grew heavier with each passing year. The other nuns at St. Catherine's noticed how Sister Margaret would sometimes pause during her evening walks through the building, staring at windows that had once looked out from the girls' dormitory. She would stand motionless for long minutes, her lips moving in silent prayer, before continuing her rounds with shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the world. More disturbing were the incidents that began occurring with increasing frequency in the 1980s. Several staff members reported finding Sister Margaret in the dining hall at odd hours, setting extra places at the long wooden tables. When questioned, she would seem confused and disoriented, claiming she had been expecting visitors who never arrived. On one occasion, a younger nun found her in the old girls' dormitory at 3 a.m., making up beds that had been empty for years. The sealed eastern wing remained untouched throughout all these changes, a forgotten section of the building that had become part of St. Catherine's landscape. Different maintenance companies had been hired over the years, as the original contractors went out of business or moved away, but somehow the extensive repairs that were supposedly needed never quite materialized. Insurance claims were processed and settled, paperwork was filed and forgotten, but the wing stayed locked behind heavy wooden doors that bore increasingly faded signs reading, "Authorized personnel only, structural repairs in progress." By 1985, only 8 children remained at St. Catherine's, and discussions had begun at the diocesan level about closing the facility entirely. The building was expensive to maintain, and the small number of residents didn't justify the cost of operation. Plans were made to convert the structure into a retirement home for elderly nuns, many of whom had spent their entire lives in service to the church and needed care in their final years. It was during this period of transition that Rebecca Chen, a young journalist working for a true crime magazine based in Boston, decided to write a retrospective piece about the Morton sisters for the 20th anniversary of their disappearance. Chen, who specialized in cold cases and unsolved mysteries, had discovered the story while researching other missing children cases in New England and was struck by the complete lack of resolution or closure. Her investigation began with interviews of everyone she could locate who had been at St. Catherine's in 1966. Most of the children who had been residents at the time were now adults scattered across the country, but Chen was able to track down several of them. Their memories of Mary and Elizabeth were vivid and consistent, 2 inseparable sisters who had brought light into an often grim institutional environment. Patricia Walsh, who had been 14 years old and one of the older girls at St. Catherine's in 1966, provided particularly detailed recollections. "Mary was like a little mother to Elizabeth," she told Chen. "She was always making sure her sister had enough to eat, helping her with her lessons, comforting her when she had nightmares about their parents. Elizabeth was the bright one, always asking questions, always curious about everything. They were special kids, and everyone knew it. When Chen interviewed Sister Margaret, now one of the few remaining people who had actually known Mary and Elizabeth personally, she found an elderly nun who seemed haunted by memories she couldn't quite articulate. Sister Margaret spoke fondly of the girls, Mary's protective nature and serious demeanor, Elizabeth's curiosity and infectious laughter, the way they would hold hands during prayers and whisper together in the evenings. But when Chen asked about the sealed eastern wing and whether it might have any connection to the girls' disappearance, Sister Margaret's demeanor changed dramatically. Her voice became sharp and defensive. Her hands trembled slightly, and she seemed to age years in the span of moments. "That area has nothing whatsoever to do with the children," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed disproportionate to the question. "It was always administrative space, offices, storage, record-keeping areas. The girls never had any reason to be there, and they certainly wouldn't have had access to it. The wing was sealed because of structural damage, and it remains sealed for safety reasons." Chen found this response oddly defensive and tried to follow up with additional questions, but Sister Margaret abruptly ended the interview, claiming she had other obligations to attend to. The elderly nun's reaction seemed disproportionate to what had been a routine question about the building's layout, and Chen made a note to investigate the sealed wing further. However, her attempts to learn more about the eastern wing proved futile. The insurance records from 1966 had been archived in a warehouse in Boston, and retrieving them required permissions that took months to obtain. The original maintenance company had gone out of business in 1971, and their records had been destroyed. Even the diocesan authorities seemed vague about the specifics of the wing's closure, referring Chen to various bureaucrats who in turn referred her to others in an endless chain of administrative confusion. Chen's article was eventually published in the spring of 1986 under the title "The Girls Who Vanished." 20 years later, the Morton mystery remains unsolved. It was a well-researched and compassionate piece that renewed some interest in the case, generating several letters from readers who claimed to have information. However, none of these leads proved credible, and the story gradually faded from public attention once again. What Chen didn't realize, what no one could have realized without access to the sealed wing, was that her investigation had come tantalizingly close to the truth. The eastern wing wasn't just an administrative area that had been damaged by water, as Sister Margaret had claimed. It was something far more sinister, and its secrets had been perfectly preserved behind those locked doors, waiting like a time capsule for someone with the authority and determination to open them. The Morton sisters remained a footnote in Vermont's criminal history, their story known only to true crime enthusiasts, retired law enforcement officers who still remembered the case, and the aging nuns who continued to pray for their souls each evening during Vespers. But the truth about what had happened to Mary and Elizabeth Morton on that December night in 1966 remained locked away, growing more dangerous with each passing year of silence. Sometimes the most important evidence isn't hidden in some remote location. It's simply locked away behind official seals and bureaucratic barriers, waiting for someone brave enough to question authority and demand answers. Sister Catherine Walsh arrived at the former St. Catherine's Home for Children on a crisp October morning in 2003, 37 years after the Morton sisters had vanished into the cold Vermont night. At just 28 years old, she represented a new generation of nuns, tech-savvy, efficiency-minded, and determined to modernize the retirement facility that the old orphanage had become. The transformation of St. Catherine's from children's home to retirement facility had been completed in 1992, after years of planning and renovation. The building now housed 24 elderly nuns from various orders throughout New England, women who had dedicated their lives to service and were spending their final years in the same Victorian structure that had once sheltered orphaned children. Sister Catherine had been trained in business administration and healthcare management before entering religious life, making her uniquely qualified to handle the complex challenges of running a modern care facility. Her background was a stark contrast to the older nuns, who had learned their roles through decades of experience and tradition rather than formal education. She brought with her laptop computers, cell phones, and a systematic approach to problem-solving that sometimes clashed with the more intuitive methods of her elderly colleagues. The young nun had heard whispers about the missing children from the older residents, particularly from Sister Agnes Murphy, who was now 79 years old and suffering from mild dementia. Sister Agnes would sometimes become agitated during evening prayers, claiming she needed to check on Mary and Elizabeth, or insisting that she had heard children's voices in the hallways. The other nuns attributed these episodes to the confusion that often accompanied aging, but Sister Catherine found the consistency of these particular delusions troubling. Sister Catherine's primary focus, however, was on the present rather than the past. The facility faced significant financial challenges, with maintenance costs for the aging building consuming an ever larger portion of their budget. The heating system was ancient and inefficient, the electrical wiring needed updating to meet modern safety codes, and several sections of the building suffered from chronic moisture problems that created health hazards for the elderly residents. It was during her comprehensive assessment of the building's condition that Sister Catherine first became aware of the sealed eastern wing. The architectural plans she had obtained from the diocesan archives showed a significant portion of the building that wasn't being utilized, valuable space that could potentially house 6 additional residents or be converted into badly needed common areas and medical facilities. When she first approached Sister Margaret O'Brien about reopening the wing, the elderly nun's reaction was swift and alarmed. Sister Margaret, now 84 years old and increasingly frail, seemed to panic at the mere suggestion. "That area is structurally unsound," she insisted, her voice carrying an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the topic. "It has been sealed for safety reasons since the 1960s. We cannot risk the well-being of our residents by opening an area that could collapse or expose them to dangerous mold and water damage." But Sister Catherine was persistent and methodical in her approach. She researched the insurance records, contacted structural engineering firms, and discovered something that troubled her deeply. No formal structural assessment had been conducted on the eastern wing in nearly 4 decades. The water damage that had supposedly necessitated the sealing in 1966 should have been resolved long ago, and any structural issues should have been documented and addressed through proper engineering studies. Her investigation revealed a pattern of administrative confusion and bureaucratic neglect that seemed almost intentional. Different maintenance companies had been paid over the years to monitor the sealed area, but no actual work had been performed. Insurance claims had been processed and settled, but no repairs had been made. Paperwork had been filed and forgotten, creating a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to prevent anyone from asking too many questions. When Sister Catherine presented her findings to Father Thomas McKenna, the diocesan administrator responsible for overseeing St. Catherine's, she expected bureaucratic resistance. Instead, she found an ally who was equally frustrated by the inefficient use of valuable space and resources. "Sister Catherine, I've been wondering about that sealed wing for years," Father McKenna admitted during their meeting in his Burlington office. "The insurance records are a mess. The maintenance contracts are confusing, and frankly, no one seems to know exactly what's behind those doors anymore. If you think the space could be useful, let's get some qualified people in there to assess the situation properly." With diocesan approval, Sister Catherine scheduled a comprehensive inspection by certified structural engineers and environmental specialists. The inspection was set for November 2005, nearly 40 years after the eastern wing had been sealed. But as the date approached, Sister Margaret's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. The elderly nun began pacing the hallways at night, clutching her rosary and muttering prayers in Latin. She would stop outside the doors to the sealed wing and stand motionless for long periods, sometimes pressing her ear to the wood, as if listening for something on the other side. The other residents reported that Sister Margaret would sometimes cry out in her sleep, repeating names that sounded like Mary and Elizabeth. More troubling were the incidents that began occurring with increasing frequency. Sister Catherine found Sister Margaret in the dining hall one morning at 4 a.m., setting 2 extra places at a table and insisting that the girls would be joining them for breakfast. On another occasion, she was discovered in the old chapel, kneeling before the altar and begging for forgiveness for failing to protect the innocent. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the physician who provided medical care for the elderly nuns, examined Sister Margaret and diagnosed her with advanced dementia complicated by severe anxiety and depression. The doctor prescribed medications to help with the agitation, but noted that Sister Margaret's symptoms seemed to be triggered specifically by discussions of the sealed wing or references to the building's history as an orphanage. 3 days before the scheduled inspection, Sister Margaret suffered a severe stroke. She was rushed to Vermont Medical Center in Burlington, where she lingered in a semi-conscious state, occasionally mumbling words that sounded like fragments of prayers mixed with what might have been names. The timing seemed tragically coincidental, but Sister Catherine felt she had no choice but to press forward with the inspection. The other nuns expressed mixed feelings about opening the sealed wing. Some, like Sister Agnes, seemed frightened by the prospect, claiming that some doors are meant to stay closed. Others, particularly the younger nuns who had arrived in recent years, supported Sister Catherine's practical approach to space utilization. The division created tension within the small community, with whispered conversations and worried glances becoming common. As November 15, 2005 approached, the date scheduled for the inspection, Sister Catherine found herself both excited and apprehensive. The practical part of her mind looked forward to finally resolving the mystery of the sealed wing and potentially gaining valuable space for their residents. But the growing sense of unease among her colleagues, combined with Sister Margaret's dramatic decline, made her wonder if there were aspects of St. Catherine's history that she didn't fully understand. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones that have been kept so long that even the secret keepers begin to forget why the silence was necessary in the first place. On a grey November morning in 2006, Sister Catherine Walsh stood before the heavy wooden doors that had sealed the eastern wing for exactly 40 years. The locksmith she had hired, an elderly craftsman named Robert Stone who specialized in antique mechanisms, worked carefully with tools designed for the intricate locks that had been installed in the 1960s. Each click and scrape of metal against metal echoed through the hallway like whispers from the past, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that made Sister Catherine's heart race. The first door opened with a prolonged creak that seemed to exhale decades of trapped air. Sister Catherine stepped into a hallway that time had completely forgotten, her footsteps muffled by dust that had accumulated in undisturbed drifts along the baseboards. The wallpaper, a pale yellow pattern decorated with tiny roses, was yellowed with age, but remarkably intact. The wooden floors, though covered with a fine layer of dust, showed no signs of the water damage that had supposedly necessitated sealing the area 4 decades earlier. As she moved deeper into the wing, Sister Catherine's confusion grew with each step. This didn't look like administrative space at all. The layout was entirely different from what she had expected based on the building's architectural plans. Instead of offices and storage rooms, she found herself in what appeared to be a separate living area, a self-contained residential suite that had been designed for privacy and isolation. The first room she entered took her breath away. It was clearly a bedroom, but not the kind of institutional dormitory space she was familiar with from the rest of St. Catherine's. This room was intimate and personal, containing 2 small beds positioned side by side near a large window that looked out over the grounds. The beds were perfectly made with white linens that had yellowed with age, and the entire space had an eerie quality of suspended time, as if someone had simply walked away and never returned. Children's clothes hung in a wardrobe that stood against the far wall. Simple dresses, wool sweaters, cotton undergarments, and small shoes arranged neatly on the floor. The clothing was exactly the kind that orphaned girls would have worn in the 1960s, conservative and practical but chosen with obvious care. Sister Catherine's hands trembled as she examined the garments, noting their small sizes and the way they had been arranged with almost maternal attention to detail. On a small wooden table positioned between the 2 beds, Sister Catherine discovered something that made her heart race with recognition and dread. 2 well-worn books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Little Women, with names written inside the front covers in careful child's handwriting. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still clearly legible. Mary Morton, age 8, and Elizabeth Morton, age 6. The discovery hit Sister Catherine like a physical blow, forcing her to sit down on one of the small chairs positioned near the table. These weren't administrative offices that had been sealed due to water damage, as she had been told. This was a private living space, and it had belonged to the 2 girls who had vanished 4 decades ago. But why had Mary and Elizabeth Morton been living separately from the other children? And why had this area been sealed immediately after their disappearance? As she explored further, Sister Catherine found more evidence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The small bathroom adjoining the bedroom contained children's toiletries still arranged on a shelf. Toothbrushes with cartoon characters, bars of soap designed for sensitive skin, a small mirror positioned at exactly the right height for children to see themselves. Everything had been left exactly as it was, as if the occupants had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routine. In the bedroom closet behind the hanging clothes, Sister Catherine discovered something that made her hands shake, with a combination of fear and grief. A small suitcase, carefully packed with children's clothing and personal items. The suitcase appeared to have been prepared for a journey. Underwear, socks, dresses, and even a few small toys were arranged with the careful attention of someone planning to travel. But the journey, whatever it had been, had never taken place. The most chilling discovery came in what appeared to be a small sitting area adjacent to the bedroom. Behind a bookshelf filled with children's stories and educational books, Sister Catherine noticed that one of the floorboards seemed slightly loose. When she lifted it with trembling fingers, she discovered a small hiding space that had been carefully hollowed out of the floor joists. Inside the hiding space was a child's diary, bound in faded pink leather, its pages yellowed with age but still perfectly legible. The diary was clearly the property of a young girl. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind that comes from hours of practice, under the strict supervision of nuns who demanded perfection in penmanship. On the first page, in that same careful handwriting, was written, "This diary belongs to Mary Morton, age 8 years old." Sister Catherine's hands shook as she opened the diary and began to read. The entries started in late October 1966, just after Mary and Elizabeth had arrived at St. Catherine's, and continued through December 14, 1966, exactly 1 day before the sisters had disappeared. The final entry was dated the night before their vanishing, written in Mary's careful script, with an urgency that was palpable even 4 decades later. As Sister Catherine read through the diary entries, a picture began to emerge that was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The Morton sisters hadn't been living in the main dormitory with the other children, as everyone had assumed. According to Mary's carefully documented experiences, they had been moved to these private quarters in the Eastern Wing just 3 weeks after their arrival at St. Catherine's. Sister Margaret had explained this move as special treatment because the girls were still grieving their parents' deaths and needed extra attention and privacy to heal from their trauma. But as Sister Catherine read further, Mary's innocent descriptions of their isolated life began to reveal something far darker and more disturbing. The entries described unusual rules and restrictions that applied only to Mary and Elizabeth. They were not allowed to interact with other children during certain hours of the day. They took their meals separately from the rest of the orphanage population. Most disturbing of all, they were required to participate in what Sister Margaret called special prayers in the evenings, private sessions that Mary described in increasingly frightened and confused terms. Se este caso já te prendeu, deixa o like. Isso ajuda o canal a trazer mais histórias como essa, e a história das irmãs Morton a alcançar mais pessoas. The sealed wing had preserved more than furniture and belongings. It had preserved the truth, in the words of a child who had tried desperately to document what was happening to her and her sister, leaving behind a record that would wait 40 years for someone to discover and understand. Mary Morton's diary, discovered in that carefully concealed hiding space, contained entries that systematically shattered every assumption anyone had made about the night the sisters disappeared. Written in the precise, careful handwriting that nuns of that era demanded from their charges, the final weeks of entries revealed a truth that was both heartbreaking and absolutely horrifying in its implications. The diary began innocently enough, with entries that reflected the natural grief and confusion of a child who had lost everything familiar. Mary wrote about missing her parents, about trying to comfort Elizabeth during nightmares, and about the strange new world they had entered at St. Catherine's. Her early observations were those of an intelligent child trying to make sense of institutional life. The rigid schedule, the communal meals, the constant supervision by adults in religious habits. But by early November 1966, the tone of Mary's entries began to shift in ways that Sister Catherine found deeply troubling. The first mention of the special arrangement came in an entry dated November 8th. Sister Margaret says, "Elizabeth and I are going to have our own room because we are still very sad about Mommy and Daddy. She says we need special help to feel better and that we will have special prayers just for us." What followed was a detailed documentation of the sisters' gradual isolation from the rest of St. Catherine's community. Mary wrote about being moved to the Eastern Wing, initially describing it as exciting to have their own space and privacy, but her subsequent entries revealed a growing sense of unease as the special treatment became increasingly restrictive and inappropriate. The special prayers that Sister Margaret conducted with the girls were described by Mary in terms that became progressively more disturbing. At first, they seemed like extended counseling sessions, where Sister Margaret would ask detailed questions about the girls' feelings, their memories of their parents and their fears about the future. But as the entries continued, Mary's descriptions suggested that these sessions were becoming something entirely different and far more sinister. Sister Margaret says the special prayers will help us forget about being sad, Mary wrote in an entry dated November 20th, but I don't want to forget Mommy and Daddy. She says I have to take off my nightgown during the special prayers so that God can see into my heart better. Elizabeth was scared and started crying, but Sister Margaret said she has to do it too, or we won't get better. Sister Catherine felt physically ill as she read these words, recognizing immediately the predatory grooming behavior that Mary was innocently documenting. The child's trust and religious upbringing had made her vulnerable to manipulation by someone who used religious authority to normalize inappropriate and abusive behavior. The entries continued with increasingly explicit descriptions of the special prayers that left no doubt about what was happening to the Morton sisters during their isolation in the Eastern Wing. Mary's writing revealed a child's desperate attempt to understand experiences that were completely beyond her comprehension, described in the innocent vocabulary of an 8-year-old who lacked the words or knowledge to fully articulate what was being done to her and her sister. Sister Margaret says the special touches are how God shows his love, Mary wrote in early December, but it feels wrong and scary. Elizabeth cries during the special prayers now, and Sister Margaret gets angry when she cries. She says we can't tell anyone about the special prayers because other people wouldn't understand God's love the way she does. The diary also revealed Mary's growing desperation and her attempts to seek help from other adults at St. Catherine's. She had tried to tell Sister Agnes about the special prayers, but Sister Margaret had intercepted these attempts and convinced the younger nun that Mary was experiencing trauma-related delusions that were common in recently orphaned children. I tried to tell Sister Agnes that the special prayers make me feel sick and scared, Mary wrote on December 10th. But Sister Margaret talked to her, and now Sister Agnes says, I am just confused because I miss my parents too much. She says I should be grateful for Sister Margaret's special attention and that I shouldn't make up stories. The final entries in Mary's diary revealed the sisters' growing desperation and Mary's remarkable courage in planning their escape. Despite being only 8 years old, she had recognized that the adults around her either wouldn't believe her or couldn't protect her from Sister Margaret's abuse. Her solution was to take Elizabeth and run away from St. Catherine's, hoping to find someone who would help them. I have been hiding some of our clothes in the little suitcase, Mary wrote on December 12th. I know it's wrong to steal, but we have to get away from here. Elizabeth doesn't understand everything, but she knows the special prayers are bad. I told her we are going to go find new people who will take care of us the right way. The planning for their escape was detailed in Mary's diary, with the methodical care of a child who understood that failure might mean something worse than the abuse they were already enduring. She had studied the routines of the nuns, noted when doors were locked and unlocked, and even identified a window in the Eastern Wing that could be opened quietly. Tomorrow night we are going to climb out the window and walk to town, Mary wrote on December 13th. I have some money I saved from before Mommy and Daddy died, and I think we can take the bus to Boston, where maybe we can find someone to help us. I'm scared, but staying here is scarier. The final entry, written on December 14th, 1966, was heartbreaking in its innocence and terror. Mary's careful handwriting showed signs of stress, with letters that were less precise and words that were sometimes crossed out and rewritten. Tomorrow night, we are going to run away for real. I packed our clothes in the small suitcase and hid it under Elizabeth's bed. Sister Margaret said tonight she has a special surprise for us tomorrow, but I don't want any more surprises. I just want us to be safe like we were when Mommy and Daddy were alive. Elizabeth is scared, but I told her we have to be brave. If something bad happens to us, I hope someone finds this diary and knows that we tried to leave. We tried to be good girls, but Sister Margaret won't let us be safe here anymore. Sister Catherine wept as she read these final words, recognizing the courage of a child who had tried desperately to protect herself and her younger sister from a predator who had used religious authority to exploit their vulnerability. The diary provided devastating evidence of systematic abuse, but it also revealed the tragic irony that Mary and Elizabeth had been planning to escape on the very night they disappeared. The most carefully buried secrets leave traces in the words of children who don't yet understand the power of silence, and sometimes those words wait decades to speak for the innocent who can no longer speak for themselves. The discovery of Mary Morton's diary transformed what had been a 40-year-old cold case into an active criminal investigation of the most serious kind. Sister Catherine immediately contacted both the Vermont State Police and the FBI, recognizing that the evidence she had uncovered suggested not just child abuse, but potentially murder. The diary's revelations demanded immediate and comprehensive investigation by trained professionals. Detective Lisa Huang, a specialist in historical cold cases and crimes against children, was assigned to lead the investigation. A 15-year veteran of the Vermont State Police, with additional training from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Detective Huang had handled some of the most complex and sensitive cases in the state's history. But even her extensive experience hadn't prepared her for the scope of what the Morton diary revealed. Detective Huang's first priority was to locate Sister Margaret O'Brien, who had been in a vegetative state at Vermont Medical Center since her stroke in November 2005. The elderly nun remained unconscious and unresponsive, maintained on life support, while her family and the diocesan authorities grappled with end-of-life decisions. Though unable to communicate or respond to questions, Sister Margaret's medical records provided crucial insights into her mental state during the decades following the Morton sisters' disappearance. The medical records revealed a pattern of severe psychological disturbance that had been carefully hidden from public view. Sister Margaret had been hospitalized multiple times over the decades for what doctors had diagnosed as severe anxiety, depression, and episodes of psychotic behavior. Most significantly, these hospitalizations had occurred with remarkable regularity around the anniversary dates of the Morton sisters' disappearance, suggesting that the trauma of whatever had happened in December 1966 had haunted Sister Margaret for 40 years. Dr. Patricia Rosenthal, a psychiatrist who had treated Sister Margaret during several of her hospitalizations in the 1980s and 1990s, provided Detective Huang with additional disturbing information. Sister Margaret would experience severe panic attacks and dissociative episodes every December, Dr. Rosenthal explained. She would become convinced that children were in danger and that she needed to protect them. During one particularly severe episode in 1987, she kept repeating that she had failed to keep them safe and that the children would never forgive her. The investigation team began the painstaking process of reconstructing the events of December 1966, with this new understanding of Sister Margaret's psychological profile and the evidence provided by Mary's diary. They interviewed the few surviving staff members from that era, many of whom were now elderly and living in nursing homes or retirement communities throughout New England. The interviews revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that had been overlooked or misinterpreted at the time. Several former employees recalled feeling uncomfortable about Sister Margaret's special interest in certain children, particularly young girls who had no living relatives to visit them or advocate for their welfare. The institutional culture of the 1960s, with its emphasis on unquestioning obedience to religious authority, had made it virtually impossible for junior staff members to voice concerns about a head nun's behavior. Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, now 83 years old and living in a retirement home in Burlington, had worked as a cook at St. Catherine's from 1963 to 1969. Her testimony provided one of the most crucial pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Brennan clearly remembered Sister Margaret's unusual arrangements for Mary and Elizabeth Morton, including her insistence that the girls take their meals separately from the other children. "I always thought it was strange," Mrs. Brennan told Detective Huang during a lengthy interview at her retirement home. "Sister Margaret said the girls needed special dietary considerations because of their trauma, but they seemed healthy enough to me. What bothered me most was seeing Sister Margaret leading them to the Eastern Wing late at night, often after the other children were already asleep. When Mrs. Brennan had questioned these nighttime movements, Sister Margaret had explained them as therapeutic counseling sessions designed to help the girls process their grief over their parents' deaths. She had all kinds of official-sounding explanations," Mrs. Brennan recalled, But something about it just felt wrong. Those little girls always looked scared when they came back from those sessions. Mary especially seemed to be trying to protect Elizabeth from something, but we didn't know what. Mrs. Brennan's most disturbing recollection concerned the night the Morton sisters disappeared. She had been working late in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the following morning when she heard what sounded like children crying coming from the direction of the eastern wing. When she investigated, she found the area locked and sealed, with Sister Margaret explaining the next morning that emergency repairs had required immediate sealing of the wing. The structural engineers who had originally been hired to examine the sealed wing in 2006 provided another crucial piece of evidence. Their comprehensive report confirmed what Sister Catherine had suspected from the beginning. There was no evidence of water damage, burst pipes, or structural problems that would have necessitated sealing the area. The emergency repairs that had supposedly kept the wing closed for 40 years had never been needed. The eastern wing is structurally sound and shows no signs of water damage or structural compromise, the engineers reported. The basement area shows some minor moisture issues typical of buildings of this age, but nothing that would have required emergency sealing or extensive repairs. The wing appears to have been sealed unnecessarily and maintained in that condition through bureaucratic oversight rather than structural necessity. Detective Huang's team also discovered financial records that raised additional questions about Sister Margaret's behavior in the months following the sisters' disappearance. In January 1967, just weeks after Mary and Elizabeth vanished, Sister Margaret had requested and received permission from diocesan authorities to travel to Montreal for intensive spiritual counseling following the trauma of losing 2 children under her care. The 3-week trip to Montreal was highly unusual for a head nun during a crisis period, when her presence would have been most needed to comfort the remaining children and cooperate with ongoing investigation. The official explanation was that Sister Margaret needed spiritual and psychological support to cope with her feelings of responsibility for the girls' disappearance. But the timing and duration of the trip raised questions about whether it might have served other purposes. Canadian immigration records, obtained through international law enforcement cooperation, confirmed that Sister Margaret had indeed traveled to Montreal in January 1967 and had stayed at a retreat house operated by the Sisters of Mercy Order. But interviews with surviving nuns from that facility revealed that Sister Margaret had seemed agitated and fearful during her stay, spending most of her time in private prayer and refusing to discuss the events at St. Catherine's. "She seemed like a woman carrying a terrible burden," recalled Sister Marie-Claire Dubois, now 91 years old and one of the few nuns who remembered Sister Margaret's visit. "She would spend hours in the chapel, sometimes crying out in anguish. When we tried to comfort her, she would only say that she had failed to protect innocent children and that God would never forgive her." The investigation revealed that Sister Margaret had used her position of absolute authority to create an elaborate system that enabled her to abuse vulnerable children while maintaining her public image as their protector and advocate. By isolating the Morton sisters in the Eastern Wing and claiming they needed special treatment, she had been able to abuse them regularly while convincing other staff members that she was providing therapeutic care. When Mary's diary revealed that the girls were planning to escape and potentially expose the abuse, Sister Margaret had been forced to take more drastic action to protect herself. The evidence strongly suggested that she had discovered their escape plan and had chosen to silence them permanently, rather than face exposure and disgrace. Power without accountability creates the perfect environment for predators to operate, especially when that power is disguised as religious authority and masked by claims of caring for the vulnerable. As the investigation intensified throughout 2007, Detective Huang's team made a series of discoveries that would finally reveal the complete truth about what had happened to Mary and Elizabeth Morton on that December night 40 years earlier. The breakthrough came when advanced ground-penetrating radar equipment detected several significant anomalies beneath the foundation of the Eastern Wing, specifically in the basement area that had been part of the sealed section since 1966. The radar sweeps revealed what appeared to be a void space beneath the basement floor, in an area that architectural plans showed should have been solid foundation. The anomaly was located directly beneath the bedroom where Mary and Elizabeth had been housed, in a section of the basement that had been inaccessible since the wing was sealed. The discovery prompted Detective Huang to obtain search warrants for a comprehensive excavation of the site. The excavation began on a cold March morning, exactly 41 years and 3 months after the sisters had vanished. Sister Catherine watched from a respectful distance as investigators carefully removed decades of accumulated debris and dust from the basement area. The process was methodical and painstaking, with forensic archaeologists using brushes and small tools to preserve any evidence that might have survived 4 decades of concealment. What they found on the 3rd day of excavation confirmed the worst fears that had been growing since Mary's diary was discovered. Buried beneath a false concrete floor that had been expertly constructed to hide what lay beneath, the team discovered a small chamber that had been carefully sealed with additional layers of cement and waterproofing materials. Inside the chamber were the remains of 2 children, their bodies carefully wrapped in what appeared to be institutional blankets from St. Catherine's. The preservation was remarkable due to the sealed, dry environment that had been created by Sister Margaret's elaborate concealment efforts. Personal items found with the remains, a small silver locket that had belonged to Mary, and a cloth doll that Elizabeth had carried everywhere, provided immediate confirmation of their identities. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic pathologist assigned to examine the remains, worked with extraordinary care and sensitivity given the age of the case and the innocent victims involved. Her preliminary examination revealed that both girls had died from severe blunt force trauma to the head, with evidence suggesting they had been struck multiple times with a heavy object. The injuries were consistent with an attack by someone much larger and stronger than the children, an adult who had used overwhelming force against 2 small, defenseless girls. The trauma patterns suggest the children were killed quickly, Dr. Chen reported to Detective Huang. The injuries would have caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes. While this doesn't diminish the horror of what happened, it does indicate that their suffering was brief. The forensic examination also revealed crucial timing information. Based on the state of decomposition and preservation, Dr. Chen determined that Mary and Elizabeth had died within hours of Mary's final diary entry on December 14, 1966. This timing aligned perfectly with the theory that Sister Margaret had discovered their escape plan and had chosen murder over the risk of exposure. Detective Huang's team was also able to reconstruct the sequence of events on the night the Morton sisters died. The evidence suggested they had been killed in the eastern wing itself, likely in the bedroom where they had been living, then immediately moved to the basement chamber that Sister Margaret had prepared in advance. The hasty sealing of the wing the following day had been necessary not to prevent water damage, but to prevent the discovery of fresh concrete and construction work that would have revealed the burial site. The investigation revealed the extraordinary level of planning and deception that Sister Margaret had employed to cover up her crimes. She had used her authority as head nun to arrange for the basement excavation and concrete work under the guise of emergency repairs, hiring contractors who had no reason to question her explanations. The insurance claims for water damage had been fabricated entirely, with Sister Margaret using her knowledge of institutional bureaucracy to create a paper trail that would justify keeping the wing sealed indefinitely. The 3-week trip to Montreal that Sister Margaret had taken in January 1967 now made sinister sense. It had provided time for any remaining evidence to be disposed of, and for her to establish an emotional alibi as the grieving administrator who had failed to protect the children in her care. Her repeated hospitalizations over the decades, always occurring around the anniversary of the murders, revealed the psychological toll of carrying such a massive secret for 40 years. Dr. Patricia Rosenthal, the psychiatrist who had treated Sister Margaret during several of her mental health crises, provided additional insight into the killer's psychology. Sister Margaret exhibited classic signs of someone carrying enormous guilt and psychological trauma, Dr. Rosenthal explained. Her annual breakdowns, her obsession with protecting children, and her inability to function normally around the anniversary dates all suggested she was reliving a traumatic event from December 1966. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Mary and Elizabeth Morton may not have been Sister Margaret's only victims. A review of St. Catherine's records from the 1960s and 1970s revealed several other instances of children being moved to special accommodations for extended periods, always involving young girls with no living relatives. While no other bodies were discovered during the excavation, Detective Huang's team identified at least 3 other former residents who had reported feeling uncomfortable about Sister Margaret's special attention. Jennifer Walsh, who had been at St. Catherine's from 1967 to 1970, came forward after the Morton investigation became public. "I was only 6 when I got there, and Sister Margaret took a special interest in me right away," she told investigators. "She moved me to a private room and started the special prayers sessions, but I was lucky. My aunt came to get me after about 6 months. I always wondered what would have happened if she hadn't." The pattern that emerged from these testimonies suggested that Sister Margaret had been a serial predator who used her position of religious authority to identify and exploit the most vulnerable children in her care. The Morton sisters had been targeted not just because they were orphaned and isolated, but because they were intelligent enough to recognize the abuse and brave enough to plan an escape, making them a direct threat to Sister Margaret's continued predation. By the time the investigation concluded in late 2007, Sister Margaret O'Brien had died in her hospital bed, never regaining consciousness after her stroke 2 years earlier. She would never face earthly justice for her crimes, never be forced to account for the lives she had destroyed and the trust she had betrayed. But the truth about Mary and Elizabeth Morton would finally be known, and their story would serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and institutional silence. The Vermont Attorney General's office issued a comprehensive report detailing the failures that had allowed Sister Margaret to operate as a predator for years without detection. The report led to significant reforms in how allegations of abuse within religious institutions were investigated and prosecuted, ensuring that future victims would have better protections and more effective advocates. Justice delayed is justice denied, but truth once revealed can never be buried again. And sometimes the voice of one brave child, preserved in a hidden diary, can speak for all the innocents who were silenced. The former St. Catherine's Home for Children was permanently closed following the discovery of Mary and Elizabeth Morton's remains, its conversion to a retirement facility deemed inappropriate given the horrific crimes that had been concealed within its walls. The building, which had housed generations of children seeking safety and care over more than a century, could no longer serve any purpose after such a profound betrayal of trust had been revealed in its most protected spaces. The Victorian structure stood empty for several months, while authorities, the Catholic Diocese of Burlington, and the local community grappled with how to address the legacy of what had happened there. Some suggested demolishing the building entirely, arguing that it had been too thoroughly corrupted by Sister Margaret's crimes to ever serve a positive purpose again. Others advocated for preserving it as a memorial or converting it to serve some other community function that might help heal the wounds that had been exposed. Mary and Elizabeth Morton were finally laid to rest in a proper burial ceremony on April 15, 2008, 42 years after their deaths and nearly 2 years after their remains were discovered. The funeral was held at St. Joseph's Cathedral in Burlington, with hundreds of community members attending, to honor 2 little girls whose voices had been silenced for nearly half a century. The entire community of Vermont's Northeast Kingdom came together in an unprecedented display of grief, solidarity, and determination to ensure that such crimes could never again be hidden behind institutional walls. Father Thomas McKenna, the diocesan administrator who had supported Sister Catherine's investigation of the sealed wing, delivered the eulogy with tears streaming down his face. Mary and Elizabeth Morton were failed by the very institution that promised to protect them, he said. Their courage in documenting their experiences and planning their escape reminds us that even the smallest voices deserve to be heard and believed. We gather today not just to mourn their deaths, but to commit ourselves to creating a world where no child will ever again suffer in silence. The sisters were buried side by side in Mount Calvary Cemetery, their graves marked with simple granite headstones bearing their names, birth dates, and the words, "Beloved sisters, finally free, forever together." The burial site quickly became a place of pilgrimage for child advocacy groups, survivors of institutional abuse, and community members seeking to remember children who had been failed by systems meant to protect them. The Catholic Diocese of Burlington issued a formal apology that went far beyond the typical institutional responses to abuse scandals. Bishop Christopher Matthews acknowledged not just the crimes committed by Sister Margaret, but the systemic failures that had allowed those crimes to continue undetected for years. The diocese established a victims' compensation fund with an initial allocation of $2 million. The though church officials acknowledged that no amount of money could address the scope of the tragedy or bring back the lives that had been lost. More significantly, the Morton case prompted comprehensive reviews of child protection policies throughout religious institutions across New England and beyond. The investigation had revealed how easily predators could exploit positions of religious authority and how institutional cultures of obedience and secrecy could enable abuse to continue for years without detection. New protocols were established, requiring independent oversight of all situations involving isolated or vulnerable children, mandatory reporting of all allegations regardless of the accused person's position, and regular psychological evaluations for anyone in positions of authority over children. Sister Catherine Walsh left religious life entirely following the discovery, finding that she could no longer reconcile her faith with the horror that had been hidden within her own community. "I entered religious life to serve God by helping others," she explained in a statement to the media, "but I learned that sometimes serving God means questioning authority, challenging systems, and refusing to accept easy explanations when children's safety is at stake." Sister Catherine enrolled in graduate school to study social work, specializing in child protection and institutional abuse prevention. She dedicated the remainder of her career to ensuring that vulnerable children would never again fall through the cracks of institutional care, working with state agencies to develop better oversight and accountability measures for residential facilities serving minors. The diary of Mary Morton was preserved as evidence of her extraordinary courage and her desperate love for her younger sister. Her final entries, written in the careful handwriting of an 8-year-old facing unimaginable terror, became required reading in training programs for social workers, child protection specialists, and law enforcement officers. Mary's words served as a powerful reminder that children often understand far more than adults assume, and that their voices must be heard and believed even when, especially when, they're speaking about trusted authority figures. Detective Lisa Huang, who had led the investigation that finally brought truth to the Morton case, kept a photograph of Mary and Elizabeth on her desk for the remainder of her career. The image, taken from St. Catherine's records shortly after the girls arrived at the orphanage, showed two small figures holding hands and looking directly at the camera with expressions that seemed to combine hope and apprehension. "They remind me every day why this work matters," Detective Huang explained. "Cold cases are never truly cold, as long as someone is willing to seek the truth and speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves." The investigation also led to the identification and prosecution of several other cases involving institutional abuse throughout Vermont and neighboring states. Sister Margaret's methods and the cover-up techniques she had employed became a case study in how predators operate within trusted institutions, leading to improved detection and prevention strategies that have since been adopted nationally. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic pathologist who had examined Mary and Elizabeth's remains, established a scholarship fund in their memory to support the education of young women pursuing careers in forensic science and criminal justice. Mary and Elizabeth's story teaches us that justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied, Dr. Chen said at the scholarship fund's inaugural event. Their courage in documenting their experiences ultimately led to their killer's exposure and may prevent future children from suffering similar fates. The former St. Catherine's building was eventually donated to a non-profit organization that converted it into a training center for child protection professionals. The eastern wing, where Mary and Elizabeth had lived and died, was completely renovated and transformed into classroom spaces where social workers, law enforcement officers, and medical professionals learn to recognize signs of abuse and respond effectively to protect vulnerable children. A small memorial garden was created on the site where the building's chapel had once stood. 2 oak trees planted side by side in memory of Mary and Elizabeth Morton grow strong and tall in the Vermont soil, where the sisters had once played during their brief time at St. Catherine's. Their branches intertwine as they reach toward the sky, creating a natural memorial that changes with the seasons, but endures through all weather, a living symbol of love that transcends death and sisterhood that cannot be destroyed even by the worst human evil. The memorial garden includes a simple bronze plaque with Mary's own words from her diary. "If something bad happens to us, I hope someone finds this diary and knows that we tried to leave. We tried to be good girls." Below those words, added by the memorial committee, is a promise: "Your voices have been heard. Your courage is remembered. Your story will protect others. Today, more than 15 years after their remains were discovered, Mary and Elizabeth Morton's legacy continues to influence child protection policies and practices throughout the United States. Their story is taught in law enforcement academies, social work programs, and medical schools as an example of how institutional authority can be corrupted and how the voices of children must never be dismissed or ignored. The sealed wing may be gone, but its story endures as both a warning and a promise. It warns of the dangers that can lurk behind facades of respectability and religious authority, and it reminds us that the most vulnerable members of society, children without advocates, without families, without power, deserve our most vigilant protection. But it also promises that truth, like light, will always find a way through even the deepest darkness, and that the courage of one child with a diary and a determination to protect her sister can ultimately bring justice even across decades of silence. The Morton sisters' story has become a touchstone for the broader movement to address institutional abuse and protect vulnerable children. Their names are invoked in legislative hearings, policy discussions, and training programs as a reminder of what happens when systems fail and when those in positions of trust betray the innocent. But more than that, Mary and Elizabeth Morton are remembered as two little girls who loved each other, who tried to protect each other, and whose courage in the face of unimaginable horror ultimately ensured that their killer could not escape justice forever. In death, they achieved what they had tried so desperately to achieve in life. They escaped from Sister Margaret's control, they found safety, and they were finally free. Their intertwined branches in the memorial garden reach toward the sky, forever together, forever protected, forever reminding us that some bonds are stronger than death, and that some voices, once heard, can never again be silenced. Inscreva-se no nosso canal para explorar mais casos arquivados e perturbadores. Obrigado por acompanhar a história das irmãs Morton. Nos vemos no próximo vídeo. In memory of Mary Morton and Elizabeth Morton, may their story ensure that no child's voice is ever silenced again, and may their courage inspire all of us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves.